Living inside a medieval castle sounded wonderful if you were the one wearing the crown. Warm fires, endless roasted meat, and people bowing every time you passed by. But for everyone else who lived behind those massive stone walls, castle life was a freezing, crowded, exhausting ordeal. Let's take a closer look at what daily life was really like. We can start with the noble women, the ones draped in velvet and sparkling with jewels. Their elegant appearance came at a painful cost. Each morning, servants began the slow process of dressing them in layers of heavy fabric, starting with a corset so tight it practically rearranged their organs. After that came the endless layers of gowns, underskirts, and sleeves, sometimes adding up to more than 50 pounds of fabric. Imagine walking around all day in that, with no chance of a bath afterward. Summer brought no relief at all. While peasants could strip down to light tunics, noble women had to keep their suffocating layers no matter how hot it got. Old records describe ladies fainting at banquets during the warmest months. One French noblewoman even wrote that July felt like being boiled alive inside velvet. Their daily routines were not much better. Noble ladies spent hours practicing activities that looked graceful, but accomplished very little. They embroidered with gold thread, learned to play instruments, and memorized endless religious texts in Latin, a language few of them truly understood. Their education was designed to make them pleasing to look at and easy to control. Most could barely read or write, and almost none handled money or made personal choices. Marriage was decided for them before they were old enough to understand what it meant. Engagements often happened when girls were only 7 or 8, and weddings took place once they reached 12 or 13. Imagine being married while still playing with dolls. Freedom was almost non-existent. Noble women were confined to a few approved rooms, usually the solar, where they sewed from morning until night under poor lighting. Many ended up with bad posture, aching backs, and poor eyesight by their 20s. Going outside required permission, guards, and full coverings. Their most important duty was bearing children, preferably sons. Medical books from the period blamed women for every fertility issue. Some remedies were beyond absurd, involving mixtures made from animal organs, ground antlers, or bizarre herbs. If a woman gave birth only to daughters, she was accused of not trying hard enough. For all her fine jewels and servants, a noble woman's life was a cage of obedience, discomfort, and boredom. Her luxury was nothing more than a golden prison. At the top of castle society, comfort came wrapped in layers of pain. While she spent her hours stitching the same patterns over and over, other residents faced very different kinds of hardship. In the castle kitchens, servants lived a life of endless labor. Their day began before dawn, long before the rest of the castle stirred. By 4 in the morning, they were already chopping wood, lighting fires, and preparing for the massive meals to come. Medieval kitchens were sweltering, smoky, and dangerous. They were often built far from the main hall to prevent fires from spreading, but the heat inside could climb over 100 degrees. The only people who never felt cold in winter were the cooks, because they were practically roasting themselves beside the food. Their work never stopped. Nobles demanded meals and snacks throughout the day, and sometimes even at midnight if someone craved roasted peacock or spiced wine. Records from the 14th century show that the largest castle kitchens prepared food for hundreds of people every single day. One English castle consumed more than 2,000 loaves of bread and 20 barrels of ale each week. The job came with constant hazards. The stone floors were slick with grease, and it was easy to slip while carrying heavy pots weighing up to 40 pounds. Burns and cuts were common, and accidents rarely earned sympathy. Dropping food or breaking dishes could mean harsh punishment. For servants and nobles alike, life inside the castle walls was no fairy tale. Beneath the glittering feasts and towering walls lay a world of sweat, exhaustion, and quiet misery. Medieval kitchens were packed with dangerous tools and brutal conditions. Enormous meat hooks hung from the ceiling. Cleavers sharp enough to slice through bone gleamed beside wooden tables, and iron spits stretched long enough to roast an entire deer. The air itself was a test of endurance. Imagine breathing in the foul mix of rotting meat, spoiled vegetables, and constant smoke. The smell clung to everything. Servants worked for hours surrounded by the stench, their lungs aching and eyes watering from the thick haze. Proper ventilation was rare, so the smoke filled every corner of the kitchen until breathing felt like punishment. Their clothes reeked so badly that they were banned from walking through certain parts of the castle, as if nobles might faint from the smell of hard labor. The cruelest part of their existence was that they rarely got to enjoy the food they cooked. While roasting exotic birds or preparing delicacies spiced with cinnamon and cloves for the lord's table, kitchen workers were stuck eating leftovers, burnt crusts, thin broth, and dry bread. One medieval account even described kitchen boys fighting over discarded bones from a feast just to taste the remaining marrow. Their hands were always rough and stained, their arms burned, and their backs permanently bent from hours of chopping, stirring, and hauling. And if a noble complained that the stew was too salty or the roast too dry, the blame fell squarely on them. For all their misery, at least the kitchen servants understood their suffering. It was direct and expected, unlike others in the castle, whose lives were twisted by rules and hierarchies that made misery far more complicated. No one knew this better than the young page boys. Childhood was a luxury they never experienced. Noble-born boys were sent away to another lord's castle at the age of 7 to begin their training. 7 years old in age when most modern children are still learning to read and play, not serving nobles or polishing armor. Their mornings began long before sunrise. They fetched water, cleaned boots, and laid out their master's clothes before anyone else was awake. Their beds were thin mats placed in hallways or side chambers, and in the winter they slept close together just to stay warm. Some even took turns staying awake through the night to keep the fire from dying out. The training was relentless. Page boys had to memorize long lists of etiquette and courtly manners. A single mistake like serving wine with the wrong hand or forgetting to bow at the right moment could earn a slap or a beating. It was strict discipline disguised as education. Beyond their duties as servants, they trained daily in horseback riding, fencing, and wrestling to prepare for future knighthood. Injuries were constant. One French record mentions broken bones, skull injuries, and countless bruises suffered by pages in just 1 year. These wounds were considered proof of toughness rather than reasons for concern. Pages also played the role of spies and messengers. Lords often used them to carry private notes or eavesdrop on conversations. Their small size made them ideal for slipping through hallways unnoticed. But getting caught could mean brutal punishment for both the page and the one who sent him. When it came to food, page boys ranked at the very bottom. They had to stand and wait until every knight and noble had eaten, before being allowed to touch what was left. Their meals were meager, often consisting of crumbs or scraps. Many spent their dinners watching nobles gorge on roasted goose or fine pastries while their own stomachs growled. Homesickness was another form of torment. Most of these boys were sent far from home, and letters were rare. Some wept quietly at night, missing their families and familiar places. A few never made it through the full training. Many ran away, fell ill, or died from accidents during practice. Those who survived long enough might one day become squires, the next stage in their path toward knighthood. But that promotion did not bring comfort, only more responsibility and higher expectations. In the world of castles, the higher one climbed, the heavier the burden became. For the lucky few who finally reached knighthood, prestige came hand in hand with a whole new set of struggles waiting beyond the castle walls. Despite all the romantic stories and noble songs, life as a medieval knight was far from a dream. Let us start with their famous armor, that shining metal shell that looked magnificent in paintings. A full suit of plate armor weighed anywhere between 45 and 60 pounds. Wearing it was like having a schoolchild clinging to your body all day. Summer battles were especially cruel. Knights would sweat so heavily inside those steel suits that they could lose nearly 2 gallons of water during a single fight. Many collapsed not from wounds, but from the heat itself. One medieval medical guide even suggested pouring cold water over a knight's head before combat, not as a blessing, but as a way to keep him from roasting inside his armor. Many knights did not die from sword strikes, but from slowly overheating like armored lobsters. And that was only part of the discomfort. Chafing was a knight's daily misery. Beneath the armor, they wore thick quilted padding called a gambeson or accaton, meant to keep the metal from slicing into their skin. But after hours of riding and fighting, those padded layers turned into soggy, sweat-soaked traps, causing painful rashes and infections. Training for knighthood began young, usually around age 7 as a page, then as a squire through the teenage years, ending in knighthood around the early 20s. By the time a man earned his spurs, he had already devoted most of his life to becoming one. Studies of knightly remains show distinctive bone changes from years of sword practice and constant riding. Their bodies literally shaped themselves to the demands of battle. Life was not peaceful either. Knights were soldiers always on call. When their lord demanded service, they had to abandon everything and march to war, often for causes they barely understood. The costs were staggering. Outfitting oneself as a knight could equal the price of a small house today, and most had to fund it personally. Jousting, the sport that looked glamorous to onlookers, was actually a dangerous gamble. Lances were designed to splinter, to reduce deadly blows, but injuries still happened frequently. Historical accounts describe broken necks, pierced lungs, and shattered faces. Even victorious knights often suffered head trauma that would sideline a modern athlete for months. A professional jousting career was short-lived, lasting only a few years if fortune smiled. Then there was the impossible code of chivalry. Knights were supposed to be brutal warriors, yet kind gentlemen, obedient servants, yet protectors of the helpless, ruthless fighters, yet merciful conquerors. Living under such conflicting ideals pushed many into despair. Medieval writings are filled with knights questioning their faith, haunted by guilt, and struggling with what we now call trauma. While knights battled for glory and fame, another figure kept the castle functioning when everyone else was away. That was the castle constable, the medieval version of a building manager, security chief, and overworked complaint receiver. While knights chased honor on the battlefield, constables stayed behind to make sure the stronghold did not collapse or fall into enemy hands. Their job never truly ended. Dawn to dusk? More like dusk to dawn and back again. Constables oversaw guards, inspected walls, managed food supplies, and kept the armory in shape. Records from one English castle show a constable was required to walk the full circuit of the walls twice a day, more than 2 miles even in terrible weather. Security remained their biggest worry. A single weak point could doom everyone inside. Constables checked guard posts, controlled drawbridges, and carried the keys to every crucial door. One medieval guide even advised tying the keys to the wrist while sleeping, because nothing says comfort like 2 pounds of metal rattling beside your face all night. The expectations were impossible. If anything went wrong, from a collapsed roof to an enemy assault, the constable got the blame. Surviving records are full of fines for small mistakes, from failing to relight torches to overlooking a damaged wall. One unlucky constable in France was even punished after lightning struck the castle's grain stores, as if he had personally called down the storm himself. The endless duties never truly ended. Constables inspected food reserves, questioned suspicious strangers, and settled quarrels among castle workers. They also acted as the lord's enforcers inside the walls, collecting fines and carrying out punishments. It was hardly a job that earned affection. Records from the Middle Ages show that constables were among the most disliked figures, ranking just below tax collectors when it came to receiving threats from furious peasants. Their living arrangements reflected their uneasy social rank. Not high-born enough to dine with the nobility, yet too important to mingle freely with servants. Most constables had small private rooms placed near gates or armories, practical for their duties, but miserable for rest. Historical documents suggest that the average constable lasted only 4 to 6 years before begging to be replaced, worn out by exhaustion, frustration, and the endless stream of complaints. Worse still was the constant interference from superiors. Lords would cancel or overrule their decisions, but still hold them responsible when things went wrong. Knights ignored security measures, then blamed the constable for breaches. Servants skipped maintenance work and then complained when equipment broke. At least the constable had a private space, unlike those who endured the most dreadful part of castle life. While the constables suffered sleepless nights over defenses and discipline, others faced darkness of another kind entirely. Beneath the castle floors lay the most feared place of all, the dungeon. Darkness carried many meanings in a medieval fortress, but none more literal than life in those underground cells. They were nothing like the neat prisons often shown in films. Most dungeons were old storage chambers, drained wells, or custom-built pits meant to make life as miserable as possible. What could land you in one of these horrific places? Almost anything. Owing money you could not repay was enough. Miss a payment, and you could find yourself chained underground until your relatives paid your debt. Argue with the wrong noble? That could earn you a stay in the dark. Accused of theft without evidence? The dungeon was waiting. Medieval justice had little interest in fairness. It worked on the idea that guilt was assumed until you confessed or died. The physical conditions were appalling. Many dungeons had no windows, no heat, and no fresh air. The walls constantly dripped with moisture, breeding mold and disease. The floors were bare earth, often soaked with filth from past prisoners. Cleaning usually meant scattering straw to absorb the waste so the stench would not rise to the halls above. Sleeping conditions were almost non-existent. A lucky prisoner might get a pile of straw. Most had to lie directly on damp stone or mud. Only wealthy captives who could pay for comfort received bedding. Rats were ever present, bold enough to gnaw at hair and fingers. One medieval record even describes inmates tying up their hair before sleeping to stop rats from chewing it off. Food arrived irregularly and barely qualified as nourishment. In many castles, feeding prisoners was not considered the lord's responsibility. Families were expected to provide meals or bribe guards to share theirs. No relatives and no money meant starvation. Prisoners might receive a small piece of bread and water every few days, just enough to survive for further questioning. Accounts from one English fortress reveal that the average inmate lost between 20 and 30 pounds during a 3-month stay. Medical help was non-existent. A cut from a rusty chain or a fever from dirty water could mean certain death. Infection, more than torture, was the leading cause of death for those trapped in the darkness below. A medieval medical manuscript once described dungeon fever as the sickness born from breathing. Foul air in places where many unwashed souls had lingered in darkness. Physicians rarely visited prisoners unless they were valuable captives worth keeping alive. Yet the worst torment was often psychological. With no sense of time, no company apart from the occasional guard, and no clue about when, or if they might be freed, many inmates slowly lost their sanity. The total darkness, the endless dripping of water, and the faint noises of castle life above turned confinement into a waking nightmare that shattered even the toughest minds. Still, these miserable captives at least received brief human contact when someone came to check on them. Amid this suffering, the castle's residents turned to the one person they believed could appeal to divine mercy, the priest. These men of faith occupied perhaps the most uncomfortable role in the entire feudal hierarchy. They were expected to represent heavenly power while depending completely on earthly lords for food and shelter. A single sermon against greed could cost them their home and send them preaching to the birds outside the walls. The priest's routine began before dawn with morning prayers. Medieval religious schedules demanded several prayer sessions each day: prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, none in late afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. This meant the priest was active long before anyone else woke, and still murmuring Latin prayers when guards took their night shift. They needed no alarm clocks. Fear for their souls kept them punctual. In theory, priests held spiritual authority even over their lords. In reality, challenging the man who paid your wages was unwise. Historical accounts record several priests dismissed for daring to criticize the behavior of noble patrons. One English cleric lost his position for suggesting that his lord drank too much. His successor wisely stayed silent, offering blessings with one hand and wine refills with the other. Holy water for the chapel, good vintage for the master, and careful silence for survival. Their list of duties kept growing in absurd directions. Beyond prayers, confessions, and masses, priests were expected to handle every superstition in the castle. They blessed swords before battles, shields before tournaments, loaves before baking, and beds before childbirth. They were even summoned to inspect odd mold patterns on the wall that someone thought resembled a saint's face. Confession duties brought the greatest strain. Castle priests learned every secret, sin, and scandal, but were bound by sacred vows never to reveal them. One French chronicle mentions a priest who developed a nervous facial twitch from the effort of holding in so many confessions. In many ways, priests served as counselors without training, listeners without choice, and the only men in the castle who might actually have preferred to be deaf. During crises, their responsibilities became unbearable. When plague spread, they had to visit the sick at great personal risk. When famine struck, they were expected to explain divine reasons for hunger. When war went badly, they were forced to justify why God allowed defeat. Whether it was dead children in winter or failed harvests in summer, the priest was expected to provide holy explanations for every tragedy. Still, for all their burdens, priests were spared the castle's filthiest labor. The worst position of all belonged to the gong farmer, the unfortunate worker assigned to clear human waste from castle latrines and cesspits. Medieval toilets, called garderobes, were simple holes that dropped directly down the walls or into storage pits below. After months of accumulation, someone had to empty them, and that someone was the gong farmer. Armed with shovels, buckets, and incredible endurance, these workers crawled through narrow passages filled with human waste, collecting what was politely known as night soil. They then hauled it beyond the walls for disposal. A single large castle produced nearly 50 pounds of waste each day, meaning these men dealt with literal tons of filth each year. The pay, however, was surprisingly high. Records show that gong farmers could earn up to 3 times more than ordinary laborers, a reward for doing the job nobody else would touch. The medieval version of career advice was simple: hold your breath and think of the silver. Most worked by night to reduce the stench's impact on daily life, and often died young from disease. Yet without their grim efforts, castle living would have been even more unbearable for everyone trapped within those cold stone walls.